You know, a number of years ago, 5, 6, 10 years ago, I'd walk into a classroom and there'd be one or two people who would look to pick fights, always, about any number of things. Don't know why, they just felt the need to be difficult. And a number of years ago, 2 or 3, we had a shift from millennials to Gen Zers, you guys. And I noticed that those people were no longer in the room. And I noticed a cognitive shift really began to emerge. Rather than looking to pick fights, rather than looking to say, you're this, you're that, I'm this, I'm that, people said, enough of this. How can we find some common ground? How can we come together? And what I think 2022 really showed was not red wave or not, but it showcased the power of you, what you could do to raise your voice, to organize.
Here we go. For more on how in the heck we got here, we have a really interesting panel for you to talk about the 2022 midterm elections. On my furthest left, we have Matt Bennett, who is the Executive Vice President for Public Affairs for Third Way. He'll tell you more about that organization. He helped establish Third Way and under the belief that there's a tremendous need for fresh thinking, critical perspective, and moderate ideas in a time of extreme political polarization. Before that, he served as Deputy Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs. That was in the Clinton White House. So welcome. We'll get to our other people. We'll welcome them one at a time. On my immediate left is Dr. Samuel Abrams, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's also a professor at Sarah Lawrence College. Dr. Abrams has been widely published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, in the journal American Interest, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, among many, many others. He has a great reputation, author of several excellent books on a variety of topics dealing with public opinion, Congress, religion and diversity, and political polarization, which is really what we're talking about. So I want to welcome him. And then right in the center is Dr. Christina Kulich from Suffolk University, who has been a very active agent of media power and talking about getting a lot of these ideas into the public realm through public television and public broadcasting and through WGBH in Boston. So thank you for facilitating this conversation, Dr. Kulich. Thank you for coming. All right, we'll turn it over to Dr. Christina Kulich.
So let's get started. You guys know me as the assignment lady, but I do other things. So I'm really, really excited to have this panel here. And it's not a panel, it's a conversation. So I want us to have a conversation. I'm just going to do a really short framing and say the title of the section is Midterms. That's kind of vague. So we're going to take this in some interesting directions, I hope. So here's what we know in a nutshell about the midterms. The predicted red wave was a trickle. Whether that was due to Democratic overperformance, Republican underperformance, we can argue for forever. And that's led us to where we are today, heading into the fourth vote for the speakership of the House, which hasn't happened in 100 years, as we heard before. So we all know those top line 60,000 mile in the air outcomes from the midterms. What I want to know from you two is, what are we missing? What do you think is our takeaways that we should be paying attention to? Just jump in.
All right. Well, the assignment lady gives very open assignments. I think I'll start with one maybe non-obvious takeaway from this election, which is that Democrats are in trouble. We did not have the big red wave that everybody anticipated. We anticipated that for a lot of reasons that we can get into if you like. Those turned out to be wrong. Democrats won races that people like me thought were absolutely essential to win to protect our democracy in 2024, like the governor's race in Arizona, Secretary of State races, those kinds of things. And we not only held the Senate, we increased our majority in the Senate, and we kept the House extremely close. So the obvious conclusion from that is that Democrats did great, except that that's totally wrong. What actually happened is that Democrats escaped by the skin of our teeth. We could have had a catastrophe for our democracy and for my party, and that didn't happen, thankfully. But what happened is that we won these races that we should have won by large margins, by very narrow margins. So one example is in Arizona, where Katie Hobbs, the new governor, won by less than a point against a woman named Carrie Lake, who was as extreme a radical as you can find in American politics, in a state that is now trending towards certainly purple, if not kind of a light shade of blue. So it was pretty scary to come that close to losing that race in a place like Arizona. And then the second thing, and we can talk about this more later, is the state of the Democratic brand, which is to say, what voters think when they see that D next to the names of candidates, most of whom they don't know anything about. They vote based on the D or the R. And the state of that thought in the mind of voters is pretty grim for Democrats. We did a big poll that we released on the day before the election showing that things are really, really bad in the state of the brand, and that's what I'm most worried about.
So I agree with all of that. I also think the world of Third Way. So thank you for doing it. Thank you for all of your hard work. I may be at AEI, which is one of our nation's leading, typically right-of-center think tanks, but I'm very appreciative of folks on the other side of the aisle. I would add to the issues with the Democratic Party and say that the Republican Party is also a mess. I would say that unfortunately, none of you have grown up in an era when the parties really made a whole lot of sense, and I think that's part of the problem. The parties are sloppy. If you looked at the presidential primaries a number of years ago, look at all the various folks on the stage. It wasn't clear what it meant to be a Democrat any more than it was clear what it meant to be a Republican. I used to very openly identify as a Republican. Now when I say that, people look at me because it could mean any number of crazy things, so I just don't identify as anything. And incidentally, that is where most Americans are right now if we look at the polling data. So I would say that both parties are in a state of disarray. We need to understand what their core values are, what their core messaging is, and we need to wrestle control, quite frankly, on both the left and the right, away from the extremists and into the centrists. It's crazy to have such small numbers of people essentially hijack what's going on. We currently see that on Capitol Hill. I think it's up to 20 folks opposing McCarthy. And again, we're watching what we call tyranny of the minority in political science. The other story that I think we should be talking about, and again, forgive me with the mask, I may have the flu, so I don't want to give it to anybody, hence this will keep me from spraying on anybody, is the fact that you are all here. I mean, this is an incredible turnout. I did not expect a room with such width and so full. And, I've been teaching now for almost 20 years. It's weird to say that because I don't think I'm old enough, but my brother reminds me I don't look like I'm an undergrad anymore, even though I think I might. So, a number of years ago, 5, 6, 10 years ago, I'd walk into a classroom and there'd be one or two people who would look to pick fights, always, about any number of things. Don't know why. They just felt the need to be difficult. And a number of years ago, 2 or 3, we had a shift from millennials to Gen Zers, you guys. And I noticed that those people were no longer in the room. And I noticed a cognitive shift really began to emerge. Rather than looking to pick fights, rather than looking to say, you're this, you're that, I'm this, I'm that, people said, enough of this. How can we find some common ground? How can we come together? And what I think 2022 really showed was not red wave or not, but it showcased the power of you, what you could do to raise your voice, to organize. The thing that scares me a little bit is the fact that it takes time to organize. It takes time to build momentum. It takes time to build movements. Movements do need leaders. And while I think there's definitely a tendency sort of understanding of the world, and I think that understanding is phenomenal. It's problem solving. It's based on problem solving. It's not based on extreme ideologies. It's based on acceptance and embracing diversity, and how do we work through that and come to consensus. But the work now needs to be done to actually create a movement, create a voice, begin to field candidates, begin to showcase this voice. And as we move forward, demand more. What do you want? It's not up to 70, 75, 80-year-old, often old white men to make decisions. It's up to you guys. How are you going to organize? How are you going to, flex your political and, ideological muscle? And if you do, I'm actually quite optimistic, because the polling that I've been doing for the last 2 to 3 years on this showcases constantly a centrism, a tolerance, and a willingness to compromise that we're not seeing among the party elites right now here in DC.
Well, let's not talk about party elites.
Sure.
Let's get back to youth voting. I had a student once, when I gave a similar kind of it's all up to you thing, say, no, you guys screwed things up. Why is it up to us? And so the answer is not you have all of the responsibility. We all do. We need to be intergenerational allies. So yes, youth voting was up, youth registration was up, but it was not even. And as Professor McLean said in his framing and introduction, second highest youth voter turnout at 27% is great, but nothing to celebrate. We have a lot more work to do. So what shaped turnout? Turnout and voting among young voters from 18 to 24 in Michigan was through the roof. It also was through the roof in Kansas. Those people were coming out not because of the D's or the R's. They were coming out because of issues. And the top of their mind was access to reproductive rights. So that's something that gives me hope. And we also saw mixed results and what we call split ticket voting a lot in Georgia, where Brian Kemp, the governor, won handily over Stacey Abrams. But Raphael Warnock defeated Herschel Walker. So that's what gives me hope, that people are separating, or at least some people, right, are beginning to decouple issues from partisan identity. Tell me I'm right or wrong.
Well, I think it's true. First of all, I want to say I agree with everything you said, most especially defining old as 75 to 80. So I want to just endorse that. But to your question, I think issues always are decoupled when voters can see the difference between voting on an issue and voting for a party so clearly. So just to give you an example from the distant but not terribly distant past. Mark Pryor used to be a Democratic senator from Arkansas. His father was a senator. The Pryor name was very popular in Arkansas. He lost his race for re-election about 12 years ago or more by like 22 points. On the very same ballot, the voters of Arkansas raised the minimum wage, a position that Mark Pryor supported and his opponent opposed. So when voters get to weigh in directly on things, or when they know something is before them very clearly, as was the case in Kansas and Michigan around the questions of reproductive rights, because it was made very clear in Kansas there had been this referendum. In Michigan, there was this ancient law in the books that couldn't be overturned unless Michigan voters took the initiative into their own hands. So when they do that, I think voters can see exactly what they're doing, and it's a little bit different than partisan outcomes. On youth vote, and I'll just be brief on this, 27% isn't great, but it's a little higher than historical average, and I think one of the reasons that Democrats have, there's a lot of infighting in our party about how best to win elections, and one theory has always been mobilize voters that don't typically vote, and that tends to be what one political scientist once called, to his now great regret, the rising American electorate, which was going to be the Obama electorate. It was young people, people without college degrees, and voters of color. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap in those categories, but that was going to be the electorate that delivered majorities for Democrats. That turned out not to be the case. And in fact, what we're seeing, and one of the things that alarms partisan Democrats like me, is that we are seeing pretty substantial decreases in the percentage of all three of those categories of voters who are voting for Democrats. And so we not only need to ensure that voters are turning out, which is very, very hard, but we also need to make sure that they're going to vote for Democrats if that's what you want out of your politics. And that's turning out to be pretty hard too.
Sam?
I think messaging matters here too. I agree with all of that.
You guys are not supposed to agree so much,
but you'd be
you are modeling civility.
Sorry.
So,
Or common sense. The heck with
No.
civility, just
yeah, it's
reason.
common sense. I'm kidding. That
And
was a bad joke.
No. So what puzzles me, and I took a look at where some of you are from. You have a lot of power if you choose to exercise it. When you go back to your college towns, which by the way are booming, if we want to look geographically, where are you? Where do we see really? Where is the economy doing well? It's in college towns. When students realize that they actually can coalesce around something, they actually can influence policy. So at Sarah Lawrence, which is not representative of very much, we're right outside of New York, in Yonkers. A number of years ago, I thought, what if I explained to the students that if we actually get 1,200 of them to vote regularly and locally, the local officials have to pay attention. They can't just ignore the community's needs, nor can the nor can federal officials, members of Congress. We actually, as a result of this, had President Biden swing by a couple of weeks ago, much to the students' delight. I found it actually more annoying than pleasant because they just shut campus down for 2 days to do it, but the students enjoyed it. And lo and behold, huge numbers of Sarah Lawrence students registered and are voting locally in Yonkers. And what do you know? They have a lot of power. They have a lot of influence, and they're beginning to make demands. And when I say demands doesn't always mean bad. It just means they're saying this is what we want, this is what we need. And you have a certain level of responsiveness. And in terms of, going back, I saw that, we have folks scattered all over the place, whether in Arkansas or Texas or whatever. Go back, go home, organize, get, voter drives and engagement going. Many places, think tanks here in DC, I can't speak for the Third Way. I know that at AEI, for instance, if you'd like someone from AEI to come speak, just invite us. We have a budget for that. We will come in and spend a couple of days with you. You can do quite a bit beyond local. You can have folks fly in and really turn it into something. And next thing you know, you have engagement and political power and agency. I don't know, how realistic that is for everyone, but for a lot of places, you'd be amazed at how much influence you can have. Once that becomes habit, we call it habitual voting. Once that becomes a habit and ingrained, who knows how things can go. So I agree, 27%, 30% is way too low. But we have to take steps right now to showcase that you do have a voice, you do have agency, and it can matter. And the more we see it, the more people will get involved.
Can I make one very quick point?
Please.
Just to give you I hear a lot, especially from young people, that their vote doesn't matter. But just to give you a sense of it, a friend of mine was a one-term member of Congress from upstate New York. I'm from Syracuse. He was from Utica. He lost his reelection by 190 votes, 190 for the U.S. House. On that same ballot in 2020, Democrats lost a House seat in Iowa by 7 votes. 7. Enough people in a minivan could have, crammed into a minivan. And then one final point is that in Virginia's legislature, some years ago, the legislature was so closely divided that it came down to one House race. And that race was tied. The popular vote in that district was tied. They had to flip a coin to determine the winner of that race and the majority in the House. So if you are told your vote doesn't count, that is a lie. You should vote.
So we live in an era of unstable majorities. That's why things feel so anxious and weird right now. We're having these razor-thin flip-flops back and forth and back and forth. If you go to my page at AI, you can see I've written a whole lot about that. So to echo your point, if these are so razor-thin, yes, these things can matter. If you go to academic political science, people say, oh, well, your voice isn't, your vote is never instrumental. Therefore, we have something called the D term. don't pay too much attention to the D term. But the fact is, and couldn't agree more, your vote does matter. A couple hundred votes can matter. A couple hundred students on a campus can absolutely change the outcome. And it's important that you realize this and take this home with you.
Yeah, I'm going to use moderator's privilege and add to that. You can also vote strategically. Come out for primaries. That's where all the action happens. There is lowest turnout, and that's how we end up with extreme candidates, because they are the ones who have got people riled up and excited about whoever they are, whatever their positions are, and they go on to the general election. So turn out to primaries. Turn out to local elections. Like, turnout in municipal elections and in local elections is horrific, like embarrassingly low. So those are also places that you can see how powerful your voices can be. And by the way, we do have local politics, and cities and states have a lot of say over your lives, over public policy. Like, can we have electric scooters in our town? Like, there are lots of different things. So we've all been talking about one word that Sam brought up, which is agency. We can tell you until, my water is gone, that you do have agency, but how do we make that wider?
You want to start?
Sure. This is where education matters. This is where making sure people take courses in civics and history matter. I live in New York City, and it's crazy to me that you can have 3 or 4 very vocal folks in a community board show up to a meeting and dominate the entire neighborhood's development. What can be, what can be placed on a street, what can't be. What about trash? What about, food service? It's incredible. And a lot of this goes back to education. And, we have systemically sort of derailed our understanding of history and civics. So to me, the way to do that, and the burden then falls on us, and not the third way, although certainly they're welcome to join, but on teaching. And this goes back not just to the collegiate level, but I would say even to quite frankly, the elementary school level. My grandma was a local electoral judge, not a real judge, but the person who sits there and adjudicates stuff on election day. And she used to take me with her, and I credit her to my interest in politics. It was so darn exciting to see those machines and to see all the little slats, and you pull the curtain closed, and boy, that seemed really, really great. So this is where public messaging matters. This is where local communities matter to make this exciting, and education really matters. There's no reason elementary school kids cannot get excited about casting ballots. My almost 5-year-old loves to cast ballots for things in school. Are they going to have the week focused on apples or pears? Certainly it's not Democrats or Republicans. Maybe less controversial. They went apple last week. But the fact is, kids at age 4 or 5 understand the power of their voice and the power to vote. There's no reason we can't take this further. And this is really about education, in my view, and our failures with that system.
I'm a pro-pear extremist.
I also like the pears.
For the record. 2 other things that you can do. One is raise your voice, not only in voting, which you must do, but also regularly. Every single day, members of Congress are told how many calls and emails they've gotten for or against a piece of legislation, something in the news, something that they may have said or done. And it matters. When you register that, now, you got to call or email your own member of Congress. They couldn't care less if you don't live in the district or in the state. But if you do, they really pay attention to that. And the second thing I'll say is run for office. There is a fantastic group on my side of the aisle called Run for Something. They are recruiting people like you to go out and run for local, state, and federal office. There is a Gen Zer about to be sworn in whenever these clowns can get their act together. They're going to swear in a 25-year-old young man who is going to be a U.S. House member. You don't have to do that as straight out of the box as your first race, but every position matters. What we've found, especially now when our democracy is under threat from people who don't believe in it, who don't believe in the American Republic, jobs like county clerk and canvassing board and all of those things are vitally important, and you can actually serve on them. And I encourage you to look into that.
And if I could just add, I again couldn't agree more. When I was in my early mid-20s, when I wanted to do this, the barriers to entry were almost impossible. I was in California at the time. It was cronyism. And I'll say it, old, rich white guys, especially in Northern California, weren't interested in me. Couldn't talk, couldn't make any inroads. Disaster. You guys have these, or most folks have these. The power you have from this, the way you can organize, the fact that it's a low barrier to entry. It's free to tweet, although I don't know if anyone's tweeting anymore. I would say a couple of months ago, it's free to tweet. I guess it's free to TikTok, although I don't know what the status is on TikTok anymore. Whatever it is, it's fairly affordable to use social media and to raise your voice and generate some constituency. I mean, I can only imagine when I was 23, 24 and in Northern California, if I could say, well, screw you. Let me talk. You can't silence me. I remember that. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional about this because I'm actually still angry about it. I was basically told, go away. You know, who the heck are you? Well, no one's going to say that today. You can't. And if someone says that to you, work around them. And that's a technology and a capacity that every single one of you have today. Use it. I wish I had it 20 years ago. I don't. So echoing everything you said, and the fact is the barriers to entry are just so much easier to or lower to engage.
Yeah. So engagement is generational. If you have role models, if you go regularly with your parents or your grandparents to polling stations, it becomes expected. But we've got this vicious cycle of people who don't see their parents voting, who don't see their families voting. So it's not regularized. It's not a habit. It's not something that they look forward to being able to do when they're of age. So you can also role model. And I can't agree more about, I just said it, I can't agree more about the lack of civics education. People don't know nuts and bolts. And if you don't know how things run, you don't know how to access the levers to get done the things that you want to. So speaking of access and oh, yeah. Go, no, just jump
one
in.
thing I also want to jump into is when I was roughly your age, and again, I feel like it's ancient now at this point, we'd always talked about the fact that politics seemed nationalized and that, local differences had disappeared. And, Republicans would look like this, Democrats look like this. You couldn't give a stump speech in one area and not the other and change them around because it would be repeated or shared. And things have gone national. And one thing to remember, and this is really important, and echoes both of your sentiments about the localism and the very narrow community focus, which is critical, is think about what happened during COVID and the lockdowns and the 2 years of the pandemic bizarreness that we had. It showcased the power of localism. I mean, I had a dinner here, or I had a meeting here in DC when lockdowns were still happening. We didn't have the dinner in Washington, we had the dinner in Virginia. Why? We could have a dinner in Virginia, we couldn't in Washington, just across the bridge. Some states like parts of Jersey, New York, Connecticut coordinated, others didn't. I think we've all lived through very vividly clear examples of just how powerful local agencies, local boards, local community decision makers are. So the idea that things are purely national is no longer the case. Some things have been nationalized, but quite a bit is local, and I hope that now you can see the power of what you can do on both a national level, but also a local level.
All right. So I want to switch things up a little bit. And we've been saying for probably decades that Congress is broken and dysfunctional, but we've reached a new peak of that at this point. Number one, it's not good for Democrats or Republicans. We need a speaker and we need a functional Congress, period. So this is not good for anybody, no matter who wins a majority of votes and whether it's because people arrange to vote present or not be in the chamber to get to that number. How do we fix what's broken in the two-party system?
That, assignment lady, is a big one.
Yes.
Yeah.
But look, I would offer a
Go
couple.
big or go home.
Exactly, a couple of ideas. One is Congress is being held hostage by 20 people right now. All of them are very radical. They're all radical Republicans because they're the ones with the majority. We have radicals on our side too. But the radical Republicans have chosen to hold Congress literally hostage. Congress cannot do anything until the speakership is resolved. So one thing we can do is attempt, and this is very hard, to replace those people. Came very, very close to beating Lauren Boebert, one of the 20, in the general election in Colorado this cycle. Others have been replaced in primaries. It is not impossible. It's very hard because the districts have become very red and very blue in most places. And the redder or bluer you get, the more likely it is that the winner of the primary will be a radical. But turn out and vote in those low turnout primary elections. And if you are adverse to what you're seeing here, then find somebody who is more of a consensus builder and somebody who wants to actually do their job and not come here and just throw bombs and show up on cable news, whether it's one side or the other. Second thing to consider is that there's a host of proposals to change the way we do voting in this country, and I think that they are worthy of your time. One is, it comes by many names and many styles, but is essentially ranked choice voting. We have that in New York City, we have it in Alaska, in Maine. Nevada voters just voted to
Yes.
bring it to Nevada, although they have to do it again, and it's a big rigmarole. But what we found with ranked choice voting in Alaska this time is that Sarah Palin was on the ballot for the House seat there, and she lost. She lost to a Democrat. A Native American Democrat won the Alaska House seat for the first time in 50 years. And she won not because Alaskans suddenly became Democrats. It's because she is a mainstream moderate candidate, and Sarah Palin was considered by those voters correctly as too radical, and because there was another person on the ballot who took votes away from her. And when they went through the ranked choice voting and people chose who their second and third choice was, Mary Peltola ended up winning. That is what we want out of ranked choice voting. We want people to, one, have the opportunity to weigh in on who their second or third choice would be, and what people like me want is that it's a moderating influence on these primaries that otherwise can empower radicals.
Yeah, I just want to add that there weren't a lot of races before for that seat to be won. Don Young was there for what, 1,000 years? 50. Sam, want to weigh in?
It's a great question, and it's a tough question. I always point to the fact that with the rise of Newt Gingrich in the mid-'90s, we really changed our norms in Congress, where, so much political science literature for decades was about norms of civility, recognizing that you're in power sometimes, that your opponent's in power sometimes. That was a moderating force and moderating influence. All of that stuff goes out the window. I still have to make my students read it. We teach it, and then I say, all right, well, now you know it, and it no longer really applies. It's very, very frustrating. So I agree. I'm sorry that I agree so much. I know you were looking for some fireworks. I don't have them today, largely because I think you're right as well. It's you folks need to vote, demand more, demand better, certainly at the primary levels. Because that's where the extremists are found, and you can knock these people out. You actually have the power to knock these people out. The fact is, if folks want to take out Lauren Boebert, they can do that. They just need to show up, and hopefully that'll happen. I think she's too extreme, period. And then voting systems, whether it's ranked choice, in academics we call it board accounting, sometimes we call it approval voting. There are all these various different approaches. But, right now, the winner-take-all system that we have is a mess, and the incentives are promoting extremism. I couldn't agree more. Are we going to be able to shift how we vote quickly or easily? Probably not. The people who are in power don't want to change it because they like it. It benefits them. But, literally in graduate school, I took 2 years of voting graduate classes with extensive modeling. It doesn't really matter. No, not at this point. But the point is, I agree, it leads to moderating thoughts. It pushes out extremism and moves people toward the center. And that's something we absolutely should try. It does not account for long-term incumbency effects, but it does certainly help with trying to find someone more palatable to the majority rather than promoting the minority. So I agree. I'll sleep on it but this is one of those questions where, the other thing is an exogenous shock might change things. Everything okay? Oh, people are running.
Yes.
Sorry, in New York, when I see people running for a microphone, I'm like, uh-oh, do I have to doubt?
For the exits, running
No,
for
in
the
New York,
exits.
that's not something you want to see. We have too many problems with that. But I had thought January 6th was actually going to be a watershed moment. I was actually excited, and I know that's perverse, because I thought seeing the Capitol under siege would have woken people up to say enough. I was wrong. I'm embarrassed that I was so wrong, but there you go.
Yeah. I'm right there with you. All right. I think we're going to wrap it up here and turn to the students.
Right.
So what I'm going to ask of both of you and the students is to make your questions short so we can get to as many of them as possible, and try to keep your answers shorter than
Take
mine.
this enthusiasm home with you. Wow. Love it.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm a history and law student from Quinnipiac University, and my question is: you guys spoke about underrepresentation in legislation. Do you think that is a result? Do you think that's a cause of poor voter turnout, or an effect of poor voter turnout?
I'm going to go with effect. If you look at the very broad, I know Quinnipiac doesn't come bold, but if you look at some very broad polling done by we call More in Common, which I highly recommend you do. It's all on the website. They do these gigantic surveys of both voters and non-voters. And what they found, not surprised anyone, which is the vast majority, 70+% of voters, put themselves in the middle, and they call them the exhausted middle because they're worn out by all the fighting on the left and the right. And then very small minorities of voters are on the extremes, but they're the loudest voices. And when the mainstream allows the extremes to be the loudest voices, either by not voting or by staying quiet, then that's what you get.
I agree.
Okay.
That's
All
exactly
right.
the problem.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Hi, my name is Alyssa. I'm a political science major from Quinnipiac University. I'm concerned about the biases of bipartisanship. When bipartisanship and centrism claim common sense, claim rationality, the other is labeled as irrational. The other is the radical is irrational. People at the margins, queer people with vaginas, such as myself, indigenous people, gender nonconforming people, black people, are labeled as irrational. My question is, how can both parties, how can mainstream bipartisanship, which has both consistently failed people at the margins, people far from the center, which is where bipartisanship claims to be, how can both parties seek to rectify this issue?
Sure. So this could take hours to discuss, and thank you for your question, but we can't do it. So I wouldn't say that the parties are in the center. I think that's part of the problem. The parties are representing slivers of the loudest, most organized groups in the room. So I think that's part of the problem. I think one of the ways to fix this, and I see it happening, and you know, one of the reasons I see it happening very, very clearly is Sarah Lawrence. As some of you may know, Sarah Lawrence has been one of the most progressive schools in the country, and one of the great things about that is that I get to see folks who have been historically on the margins learn how to raise their voice, learn how to organize, learn how to speak. And if we look at the data on this, I would say that yes, folks certainly feel like they're on the margins, but most people feel like they're on the margins in some capacity. And we see the voices becoming stronger, becoming better organized, and people are beginning to pay attention on the left, certainly, less so on the right. But I would actually blame both the parties right now for not trying to be as inclusive as they could be. So I understand exactly and empathize and totally respect that viewpoint. But I would say the bigger issue is I think you have these narrow elites saying that if you're not in the middle with us, or they're not in the middle, you're not with us, you're just out. I mean, we don't have time to break this down fully, but I would say we need to continue to organize, push, and these parties have to become more inclusive or they're dead.
Thank you.
I 100% agree with that.
I'm loving you guys. Did you plan this?
Well, I love the Third Way. It's a great organization.
Hi,
Always
good
have.
morning. My name is Serena Chaudhry from Miami-Dade College. I'm an education and political science major. My question is, how do you feel about the new influx of first-generation first-generation citizen Gen Zs moving back to their home countries due to the lack of democracy since they gave up the United States?
Just to clarify, you mean first generations who are going back because they feel like democracy is failing here?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's horrifying. Like, it's a state that none of us who are old in this room could have imagined even 15 years ago. The idea that we would lose residents or citizens because people didn't have faith in the American democracy, the strongest, most durable democracy on earth, is is terrible. And I think you put your finger on a real thing, and it's shocking. And it is, I think, no matter what your political beliefs, the very first principle should be that you believe in American democracy.
I would say it's an embarrassment for us as a nation. Simple as that. I mean, we are a nation that is, in theory, welcoming, inclusive. I can tell you my immigrant story. It means the world to me. The fact that other folks come here and think that life isn't better and they don't have the opportunity to be prosperous, free, and most importantly, live life to the way they are comfortable living it is a disgrace as a nation. And I don't think this is a partisan issue. I think any Republican, any Democrat should be embarrassed by that fact. I certainly am.
Thank you.
Are you guys okay with doing a lightning round so we can get through some more questions? I think we are this way. So make your questions as quick as you can. We'll go 3 on this side, 3 on this side, and see what you do with it.
If I can-
I think we're on that side first.
All right.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Theo Faria, and I'm studying sophomore at Miami Dade College. I wanted to ask you about what do you think in the currently divided Congress are some moderate policy ideas that could actually work and pass to improve the current status quo in America?
3 on this side, 3 on this side.
Hi, my name is Archimedes Rivero. I am a student at the Miami-Dade Honors College. My question is, what are similarities and differences between the polarization we see now versus the polarization we've seen in other time periods in American history, such as Watergate and the Vietnam War, and our recent trend signaling a transition of the political status quo during these crisis periods in the long term?
Hello, my name is Elijah Brown, a student at East Stroudsburg University, political science student. So my question is regarding youth turnout. So our previous speaker mentioned that youth turnout is based on progressive movement right now. We're identifying with progressives as a whole entire Gen Z. And I know previously you mentioned that centrism is what you found in your data is where students, or not students, but like Gen Z is identifying with. And Third Way also defines centrism as center-right economics with center-left social policy. And this is on your website. So the next thing, well.
Just to clarify, I'm sorry, that is definitely not on our website. We are not center-right economics. That's wrong.
So, but back to the conversation, I just want to focus on, can you define extremism on both sides when you talk about this? Because I feel like there's a little of a question regarding the students here because we're confused on what you mean by extremism, specifically with the left.
My name is Melanie Quackenbush. I'm from Hofstra University. I want to go into education after college, and so I was wondering your thoughts specifically on elementary school, how we can teach them about civics, including things like field trips to poll sites and all those kinds of things.
My name is Antonia Fama. I'm from Robert Morris University. And my question is, what do you think is the motivation and reasoning behind Gen Z's self-censorship in expressing political views and showing up to vote in relation to their high levels of anxiety?
Hi, my name is Jameera McBride. I'm from Temple University. I'm a sociology major. My question is, even though generations have differences, like voter rights, voter eligibility remains the same for different groups. In 2020, there were 55% of white Gen Z voters that were eligible and only 14% eligible Black voters. How do we rectify the mass incarceration of Black men and systematic racism to protect the Black vote of this in the next generation?
You guys want to synthesize? Where do you want to jump in?
I'll start. And what amazing, fantastic questions. And I wish we had like 3 hours. That last question alone that's a full seminar, but we'll do our best. On the first couple of questions, what are some moderate ideas that could move in this Congress? I don't know. I mean, much will depend on who ends up as speaker, and I don't think very much can move. There's an outside chance things like regulatory reform could move, but don't hold your breath. I think that at best, what Congress will do is keep the doors of government open, which is to say they have to pass budgets, and then I very much hope that they raise the debt ceiling, because if they don't, the global economy collapses. So let's hope for that. But beyond that, I don't think there's much that they're going to be able to do. One other question that was raised was around how do we define what it is to be kind of a radical on the left? That is a really tough question to answer quickly, but I will say that there are people in Congress who identify as democratic socialists. That is pretty far outside the mainstream of American thought. There may be a bunch of people in here who also identify as democratic socialists. I'm just here to tell you there's not a ton of you out there. And so if you are looking at like what characterizes ideas and ideology as mainstream versus more extreme, if you are in a small group of people who have a fairly radical set of ideas around the function of government, so for example, Medicare for all would socialize 1/5 of the American economy and would cost $30 trillion. By Bernie Sanders' own reckoning, that may be a good idea, but it is a pretty radical idea. And so I think that's kind of how we think about it.
I'll be very, very brief, because again, we could talk for hours. Thank you for being from Temple. My parents met in math class in their first year, and a few years later I showed up. So we are owls all the way. So the first thing to say is that there's often a lot of bias on college and university campuses, right? That's where the democratic socialist professors tend to be. So when you are on campus, that viewpoint, which again is legitimate, I want to be very clear about that. I would not delegitimize those views or ideas whatsoever. They seem more pronounced and more potent than they are among most Americans when you get off the college and university campuses. The one thing I also just want to add to all these questions is take a look at my book. Yes, I'm plugging my book. I'm sorry. One of them is called Culture War: The Myth of a Polarized America. And you'll see that traces the history of various levels of polarization when we're angry and at each other's throats. And we've been through these periods before. We've gotten over them. That there are many, many differences today with increased technology, increased access to content. Things are different thanks to technology. One thing to note, though, especially when you had mentioned something with Watergate, when it was clear that Nixon had committed high crimes and misdemeanors, there was no question Congress unified and was going to throw him out. There was no question he was going to be charged and in deep trouble. That differs obviously from today, where whether or not Trump is guilty, and I'm pretty sure he is, it's become deeply, deeply political and polarized, where certain members of Congress on the right will refuse to look at evidence and the truth in this case. So there are some very real differences, and that scares the what out of me, because that to me is a failure of their duty, their oath to the Constitution, and that is where polarization gets very, very dangerous. Nixon clearly had done that. There was no question. People on the left and the right were getting ready to kick him to the curb. Trump, not so much, and that's a big difference we see among the elites today.
Can I just add, I don't want to ignore a couple of the questions over here very, very quickly. One is on the question of how do we deal with systemic racism and mass incarceration. Again, it's participate in the process. Don't give up. Go out there and vote. The people who have passed the laws that led to mass incarceration are elected officials. They're elected by voters, and you can be a voter. So you need to raise your voices, both through voting and otherwise, to make sure that they know where you stand on this. And then on the question of teaching at a young age, civics, couldn't agree more. It is desperately needed. By the time most kids get to high school graduation, they literally have no idea how our system works, and that's a catastrophe.
I can concur, because I'm running what I feel like a rescue mission at the college level, because you haven't been taught. We've failed in teaching civics, teaching the nuts and bolts.
One thing to note is, I'm very proud that I grew up in Philadelphia. I grew up walking by Independence Hall. This was part of me, and I didn't realize just how darn special it was. But America is a great country and a very diverse country, and I've been very lucky to drive across it many, many times. Every place has something of great civic import. So even if you're not lucky enough to literally have the Liberty Bell, and I grew up being able to touch the Liberty Bell, which was kind of cool. Can't do it anymore, of course. That was inspirational, but every county has some really great story. And we need to embrace those stories for the good, the bad, and the controversial. Know what it is and actually turn that controversy, turn some of the bad stuff into motivating forces for future engagement.
I'm getting the evil time eye. So we're going to bring this to a close, but we could talk for hours. So I'm going to publicly invite you to participate in our webinar series, maybe
Sure.
come back and you guys can continue to ask questions because you will be invited too. So thank you so much.